Welcome to another audit walkthrough video from SuperfastCPA. I'm Logan, and in today's video, we're going to be going over Audit Area 2. This is Section E. This is an application topic. Determine appropriate substantive procedures to test relevant assertions for each significant class of transactions, significant account, and disclosure. And we're going to be doing that the SuperfastCPA way, which is diving straight into the questions to learn the material. Now, if you don't know much about our strategies, make sure you go to superfastcpa.com and sign up for our free 1-hour webinar training. Again, it's free, and we will teach you in that 1 hour the key ingredients to passing the CPA exam so you don't waste months or even years of your time. So make sure you check out the webinar. And just letting you know, in today's video, we're only going to be going over 5 questions, but SuperfastCPA Pro members get access to the full 10-question version of the video when we post it in the members forum. So if you like this and you like our other videos, make sure you check out becoming a SuperfastCPA Pro member to get access to the full versions of these multiple choice question walkthrough videos. With all that, let's dive straight into the questions. All right, here we are at question 1. Let's take a deeper dive into substantive procedures. We kind of talked about them a little bit in the previous video, but we're going to learn a lot more about them in this video. So let's walk through this. In which of the following situations would a primarily substantive approach not be taken when testing a significant class of transactions or account balance? Okay, so which of these situations is when they're not going to take a primarily substantive approach? So let's go through the options. Option A, the auditor has identified that there are no effective controls over the account balance. Option B, the auditor has assessed implemented controls as ineffective in preventing or detecting material misstatements. Option C, the auditor has determined that testing controls would be inefficient and more costly than substantive procedures. And option D, the auditor has tested controls and concluded they are operating effectively. Okay, so which one of these is a situation where they're not going to use primarily substantive procedures? Now, based on what you learned in the previous video, if you watched that, you might have a general idea of when you would want to use substantive procedures already, but if not, that's okay. We're going to learn from this explanation and throughout the rest of the video more about substantive procedures and how and when to use them. So let's go ahead and dive into the explanation. All right, here we are at the answer D. The auditor has tested controls and concluded they are operating effectively. So that's when you would not use a primarily substantive approach. Now, this is a pretty simple explanation, but this is important. These are the kinds of things that you want to look for when you are going to mainly use substantive procedures. So let's walk through this. A primarily substantive approach is used when an auditor cannot rely on controls due to their absence, and that was option A, ineffectiveness, that was option B, or when it is more efficient to rely on substantive procedures instead of testing controls, and that was option C. So if it is more efficient to do substantive procedures instead of testing controls, or if there aren't any controls to test, or if those controls are ineffective, that's when you're going to be mainly focusing on substantive procedures. However, if controls are tested and found to be effective, and that was option D, the auditor may rely on them and reduce the extent of substantive procedures. So if the controls are reliable and they are effective, you can reduce how much substantive testing you do, but in the other situations, you're going to mainly rely on substantive procedures. Now let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 2. And something I always like to point out when it is an option is to read the last part of the question first. So read the last sentence, because that will give you context very frequently for what the question is about. And imagine you are on test day and you read the last sentence of the question, and just like this, you read which substantive procedure is the auditor most likely to perform. Immediately you know you're dealing with substantive procedures. And on test day, you're going to see upwards of 50 or 60 different topics potentially. And the quicker that you know what you're dealing with in that question, the better. So again, this is a test day strategy. Read the last sentence first. Which substantive procedure is the auditor most likely to perform? Let's go up to the top. An auditor is testing the completeness of a company's revenue. The company has a high volume of relatively uniform sales transactions and maintains stable historical trends in its revenue data. Again, which substantive procedure is the auditor most likely to perform? So let's walk through the options. Option A, tests of details, such as tracing individual sales transactions to supporting documents. Option B, substantive analytical procedures, such as comparing revenue trends to prior periods and industry benchmarks. Option C, inquiry of management to confirm that all revenue transactions have been recorded. And then option D, observation of revenue transactions being recorded in the company's accounting system. So which one of these is a substantive procedure and which one is the most likely that they would perform in this situation? Now, again, if you watched the previous video, you kind of have a little bit of an idea about what substantive procedures are and maybe what test of controls or analytical procedures are. But if you didn't watch that one, then you might not really know what this is talking about, and that's okay. We are using these questions to, again, learn what we're supposed to know. So if you want to, pause the video and think through this. If not, let's go ahead and dive into the answer. All right, here we are. The answer is B, substantive analytical procedures, such as comparing revenue trends to prior periods and industry benchmarks. So that's probably what they would do in this situation. So let's read through the explanation and kind of learn what the difference is between substantive analytical procedures and tests of details and the other options, of course. Substantive analytical procedures are typically used when an account has a high volume of transactions that follow predictable patterns, as they allow auditors to efficiently identify unusual fluctuations. So that was option B, and that's the correct answer. These procedures are also commonly applied when tests of controls indicate that controls are operating effectively, allowing the auditor to reduce detection risk to an acceptably low level. So there's two types of substantive procedures typically. There's substantive analytical procedures, and there's tests of details. And you would want to use substantive analytical procedures when there's a high volume of transactions, predictable patterns, or when the controls indicate that they are operating effectively. So you can use substantive analytical procedures in that case to reduce detection risk. Now, there's also tests of details. Tests of details, and that was option A, are more appropriate when obtaining evidence regarding the existence and valuation of account balances, or when tests of controls indicate that controls are not operating effectively or were not performed. Inquiry, and that was option C, alone is not a sufficient substantive procedure and is usually actually a test of controls. And observation, that was option D, is generally also a test of controls rather than a substantive procedure. So option C and D are more tests of controls than they are substantive procedures, so that's why those weren't the correct options. And then test of details, it was not correct because that's, again, more appropriate when you're trying to gather evidence about the existence and valuation of account balances, or if the controls are not effective or they're not really even there. But in this case, we wanted to use substantive analytical procedures because, high volume of transactions, predictable patterns, and, if you want to learn about revenue trends, you want to learn about the patterns. So that makes sense why we're using substantive analytical procedures. Now, with that, we learned a little bit more about substantive procedures and, the two different types, the analytical procedures and the test of details. Now let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 3. In which of the following situations would substantive procedures probably not be used as the primary source of audit evidence? Okay, let's go through the options. Option A, when substantive procedures take less time than testing controls and provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Option B, when testing assertions related to material transaction classes, account balances, and disclosures. Option C, when performing the financial statement audit portion of an integrated audit. Or option D, when controls over a significant transaction class are tested and found to be effective and reliance on controls reduces the need for substantive testing. So again, in which of these situations would you probably not use these substantive procedures as the primary source of audit evidence? Now, if you don't really understand that, we haven't really talked about this side of substantive procedures quite yet. So if you don't know, that's okay. We're going to use the answer to learn about this. But if you have an idea based on what we've learned and maybe what you learned in the previous video, maybe pause the video, think through this, and when you're ready, come back. We'll look at the answer together. All right, here we are. The answer is D, when controls over a significant transaction class are tested and found to be effective, and reliance on controls reduces the need for substantive testing. So that's the case where you would probably not use that as the primary source of audit evidence, but in the other situations, you might be able to do that. So let's walk through this. Substantive procedures are typically used when they are more efficient than tests of controls while still providing sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So option A is something that would occur. They are also necessary for all relevant assertions related to material transaction classes, account balances, and disclosures, even if controls are tested. So that's another moment where you are going to have to do substantive procedures. You have to do them for all material transaction classes, account balances, and disclosures. Additionally, even in an integrated audit, and just a reminder, an integrated audit is an audit of financial statements and internal controls at the same time, two separate audits happening at the exact same time, where both financial statements and internal controls are audited, like I said, substantive procedures are required for the financial statement audit portion. So the financial statement audit portion of an integrated audit requires that you do substantive procedures. So that's another moment where you're definitely going to be using that as a primary source of audit evidence. However, if an auditor tests and determines that controls over a significant transaction class are effective, they may reduce the extent of substantive testing. And that was option D, and that's the correct answer. In such cases, reliance on controls provides the necessary audit evidence, making substantive procedures less critical. So with that, we learned about more times when you are definitely going to be using substantive procedures, going to be using them when they take less time than testing controls, and as long as the controls don't need to be tested for some reason. You're definitely going to use them when you are testing assertions for material transaction classes and account balances and disclosures, and you definitely have to do them when you're doing the financial statement audit portion of an integrated audit. So we learned a little bit more about that. Now let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 4, and remember, we read the last sentence first. Why would the auditor most likely decide to perform tests of controls in this environment? So let's go up to the top. A company processes nearly all of its transactions through a highly automated system with minimal manual intervention. So again, why would the auditor most likely decide to perform tests of controls in this environment instead of maybe substantive testing? Let's go through the options. Option A, to confirm management's assertion that the system is operating efficiently. Option B, because substantive procedures alone may not provide sufficient audit evidence regarding the reliability of transaction processing. Option C, to replace substantive procedures entirely and rely solely on control testing. Or option D, because automated systems eliminate the need to assess control risk. All right, so based on everything we've learned so far about substantive procedures, you might be able to pause this and kind of think through this and decide on the correct answer. I would recommend that you do that, so think about this, and when you're ready, come back, we'll look at the answer together and learn a little bit more about this. All right, here we are. The answer is B, because substantive procedures alone may not provide sufficient audit evidence regarding the reliability of transaction processing. So that's why they would most likely decide to do tests of controls in this environment. So let's walk through this. In a highly automated environment, transactions are processed electronically with little to no manual oversight, at least in this environment. As a result, errors or misstatements may not leave a visible audit trail, making it difficult to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence through substantive procedures alone. In such cases, the auditor performs tests of controls, so that's option B, to assess whether controls over transaction processing are operating effectively, which allows for a lower assessed level of control risk. So in a highly automated environment where things are done very electronically and it's kind of hard to use substantive procedures to find those audit trails and to find that audit evidence, you might need to use tests of controls to make sure that it's operating efficiently so that you can lower the assessed level of control risk. Let's talk about the rest of this. Management's assertion about system efficiency, and that was option A, is not the primary reason for testing controls. And if you watched the previous video, you learned about that. And while controls can reduce the need for some substantive procedures, they do not eliminate them entirely. And that's a key point right there. You almost always have to do substantive procedures. Rarely can you eliminate them entirely, if ever. You might not ever really be able to eliminate them entirely. Additionally, control risk must still be assessed even in automated environments. So you still have to assess control risk even in an automated environment. In this case, you might have to do tests of controls instead of being able to rely on substantive procedures alone, potentially. Now with that, we learned a little bit more. Let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 5. Which of the following factors would most likely lead the auditor to perform substantive procedures closer to year end rather than at an interim date? So let's go up to the top. An auditor is determining whether to perform substantive procedures for a company's year-end financial statement audit. So again, which of the following factors would most likely lead the auditor to perform substantive procedures closer to year end rather than at an interim date? So let's go through the options. Option A, the auditor has assessed control risk as low and determined that controls are operating effectively. Option B, the company has a stable financial reporting process with few significant changes from prior years. Option C, the auditor has identified a high risk of material misstatement in certain account balances. Or option D, the company has routine, predictable transactions that are unlikely to change significantly in the last quarter. So, in which of these situations would they most likely do it closer to year end instead of maybe at an interim date when it comes to substantive procedures? So, if you don't really know, that's okay. We're going to use the answer to learn about this, but if you want to give it a guess, pause the video, come back when you're ready, and we'll look at it together. All right, here we are. The answer is C. The auditor has identified a high risk of material misstatement in certain account balances. So let's walk through the explanation. When the risk of material misstatement is high, and that was option C, substantive procedures should be performed as close to the end of the reporting period as possible. This reduces the risk that material misstatements will occur between the time of testing and year end. So if you have a high risk of material misstatement and you're nervous that if you tested at an interim date, but then something happened between the interim date and the balance sheet close, that would mean that you would want to do the testing as close to the end of the year as possible, or as close to the end of the period as possible. But let's talk about the other options. If control risk is assessed as low and controls are effective, that was option A, or if transactions are routine and stable, and that was option B and D, the auditor may perform substantive procedures at an interim date and roll forward the conclusions to year end. This allows for a more efficient audit while still obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So again, in situations where the control risk or the risk of material misstatement is higher, then you want to do the substantive procedures as close to the year end as possible. But if it's assessed as low, or the controls are effective, or the transactions are routine and stable, then you might be able to perform the substantive procedures at an interim date and kind of roll those conclusions to the year end, assuming that everything will probably be fine. It's never going to be 100% perfect, but you might be able to assume that it will be able to kind of be projected to the end of the year in those situations. So again, another situation where you have to decide when and how to use substantive procedures. Now, with all that, we've learned a lot in 5 questions, a whole bunch about different aspects of substantive procedures. Before we do anything else, let's do one more part of the SuperfastCPA process called pillar topics. Now, the idea behind pillar topics is as you're going through the questions to learn the material, you will notice the things that keep popping up in the questions. We've seen 2 or 3 questions trying to teach you about the different types of substantive procedures, such as tests of details, or substantive analytical procedures, or whatever the case is. Again, you notice these in multiple questions, so you take a moment and you write these out in your own words as the pillar topics, as the most important things that you learned from the questions that day. And as you're doing this each day, you're building your own personal repository of the most important things you learned from the questions so that you're ready for exam day. And again, you're doing this all in your own words. So let's go ahead and look at the pillar topics for this video. All right, here we are at the pillar topics. Let's just dive straight in. The first one is about when a primarily substantive approach is used. Auditors use a primarily substantive approach when there are no effective controls, when controls are assessed as ineffective, or when testing controls would be inefficient. If controls are tested and found effective, the auditor may rely on them and reduce substantive testing. And pay attention to that. It almost always says reduce. You're not really ever going to see it eliminate substantive testing completely. So just make sure you know that. Now let's talk about the types of substantive procedures and when they are used. Substantive procedures include substantive analytical procedures and tests of details. Analytical procedures are often used for accounts with high transaction volume and predictable trends, while tests of details are used for existence and valuation assertions or when controls are ineffective. Now let's talk about automated environments. Remember, we talked about that. In highly automated environments, auditors often perform tests of controls because substantive procedures alone may not provide sufficient evidence. If an auditor cannot reduce detection risk solely with substantive procedures or tests, they must assess and rely on controls. Now let's talk about timing of substantive procedures, and that's kind of what we talked about at the end. When the risk of material misstatement is high, substantive procedures should be performed closer to year end. If risk is lower, such as when controls are effective, substantive procedures can be performed at an interim date with follow-up procedures extending conclusions to year end. So with that, again, those were the pillar topics. Those were kind of the main things that we learned from the 5 questions. And that is the end of this YouTube version of the video. Remember, we only went over 5 questions in today's video, but SuperfastCPA Pro members will get access to the full 10-question video when we post it in the members forum. So if you like this and you like our other videos, make sure to check out becoming a SuperfastCPA Pro member to get access to all the walkthrough videos and, of course, the Pro course, where Nate explains in detail exactly how you're supposed to be studying every single day. It's basically a much more in-depth version of the webinar. Speaking of the webinar, make sure you also go to SuperfastCPA.com and sign up for our free 1-hour webinar. That is the best way to kind of get introduced to SuperfastCPA and to kind of have a path to becoming a pro member. So check out the webinar, then check out becoming a pro member if you like all these videos. Now, if you did like the video, make sure to like it and leave a comment. I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.